LT was Ripper, who brought me the first and only news I heard about Nazi atrocities. During a tense encounter, while facing the enemy, this luckless comrade confronted me with the truth, but I turned him down. The fateful meeting occurred in the spring of 1944. The tundra was still covered with a thick blanket of snow when I visited the stronghold of one of our platoons. Corporal Roper, who was stationed there, had sent me a message that he was fascinated by my political ideas and wanted to tell me his own. Since he did not wish to speak in the presence of the other men, he asked me to join him while standing watch. That was quite unusual because talking on watch was generally not allowed. However, his solemn face and secretive manner persuaded me to follow him to the rampart. Since we had the same rank, we were on a first-name basis, but today I recall only his last name, not his first. With the benefit of hindsight, I am inclined to believe that this gap in my memory has some deep-seated psychological reason. At any rate, the fact is that I remember only his family name, Roper, which lives in my memory as a painful reminder of that somber morning in 1944 when I failed to respond to a call of destiny. I believe that everybody, once or twice in his life, is called upon to stand up for truth and decency. Of course, had I done so, I would not be alive today, for it is a distinctly German tragedy that it does not always speak well of a man's past if he has survived his nation's darkest hour. Roper and a few other men had joined our company a few weeks earlier as reinforcements. Thus, I was only superficially acquainted with him, but somehow I had learned that he was half Jewish. That was unusual in the German army. Even more extraordinary was the fact that his brother was serving in the SA Standarte Feldherrnhalle, an elite division of the SA, equivalent to the Waffen-SS. Such things happened only toward the end of the war, when Hitler needed ever more lives to be sacrificed on the battlefield. There is also the possibility that Roper was not half but only 1/4 Jewish. Anyway, as I learned later, his father was a renowned neurosurgeon in Hamburg, and his mother was the Jewish part of the family. It was a cold morning. The Russians were only a few hundred meters away. Roper, who had come directly from Germany, wanted to tell me a few things he had learned there. We were standing behind a rampart of beams and rocks. In the east, a pale stripe of daylight was rising in the gloomy sky. I was nervous because only a few days before, the Russians had tried to overrun one of our strongholds. I also suffered from the old weakness of seeing movement where there was none. Roper was uneasy because of the things he wanted to tell me. He began not with the Jews, but with the German resistance fighters and the fate of their families. When these men are trying to hide from the Gestapo, he said, their wives or parents are thrown into prison. I was thunderstruck. Taking hostages went against every fibre of my being, against my instincts, my sense of decency, and my concept of justice, everything I had learned in my parents' home. But I wasn't sure whether Roper spoke the truth. Why was he telling me these things? What was his motive? I didn't want to ask him because I didn't wish to hear more of this. Vacillating between belief and disbelief, I busied myself staring at the boulders in the distance that a vivid imagination could persuade to move. There was a long silence. I dared not look at Roper, but I could feel that he observed me intently. I think he was struggling with himself, trying to decide whether to trust me or to let this brief encounter empty into a sea of silence. Finally, his burning desire for empathy won the upper hand. With a hushed but imploring voice, in a few terse sentences, he told me that Jews were being systematically murdered in the concentration camps. I do not recall him mentioning the crematoria, but I distinctly recollect the name Theresienstadt. That's where they kill the Jews, he said. I also remember him saying that this particular extermination camp lay in Silesia, Germany. Searching for the place of horror after the war, I learned that the arrogantly Germanized name Theresienstadt stood for Terezin in Czechoslovakia, and that the Nazis used the camp as a demonstration model for international Red Cross inspectors. This meant that the victims were treated relatively well before they were murdered. As I am writing these lines, I receive from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum a calendar entitled Children's Drawings from Terezin. The accompanying letter says that the children were allowed to paint only flowers, blue skies, and happy faces. I am afraid they went to their death at the time Roper tried to alert me. Now I turned around. I shall never forget his face. Glowing with emotion, it reflected a bewildering blend of age-old grief, intense questioning, and anxious hope. This was the truth that stared me in the face, and it demanded an answer. But I could not utter a word. I felt pushed with my back to the wall. I knew that this was the trial of my life. But if I believed his allegations, then everything would change. My whole life would be affected. The consequences would be enormous. I trembled. I looked for an escape, for I could not muster the courage to face the truth. It is said that, in a moment of mortal danger, a person's whole life unwinds before his inner eye within an instant. I had a similar experience, but with regard to the future rather than the past. I saw the frightening implications of answering in whatever form Roper's appeal to my conscience. I imagined myself standing before a military tribunal. I saw my own death by firing squad. I envisaged my helpless parents and bewildered brothers. I even read the official bulletin that another enemy of the people had been exterminated. Paralyzed by fear, I suddenly heard myself murmuring, "Well, if thousands of our people are dying every day, we must see to it that an equal number of our enemies also die." It was a cop-out and a double lie. Germany was not the only nation that was losing thousands of people every day. Our enemies were also dying. But we were not talking about dying in battle, we were talking about genocide. This was as clear to me then as it is now, but I lacked the fortitude to bear the consequences. That's why I chose to distort the issue. And that's how that gloomy morning hour at the Arctic Ocean became the moment in my life I now am most ashamed of. At the time, I desperately wished it away. But today I feel otherwise. Shame is a God-given catharsis to cleanse the soul. I welcome it. It keeps the episode of 1944 alive in my consciousness as long as I live. It tells me who I was and who I am now. Discouraged by my lame reaction, Roper fell silent. He must have been deeply disappointed. Today I know that he was seeking a confidant, as he was already planning the desertion that cost him his life. He needed an ally and interpreted my criticism of Hitler's strategic conduct of the war as a veiled signal that I opposed the whole regime. He knew about my friendship with Walter and his criticism of the Nazis, and he suspected the same anti-Nazi sentiment in me under the guise of my patriotic demeanour. It was my reaction, or lack of it, that dissuaded him from tucking me any deeper into his confidence. The second part of the tragedy happened in late summer of 1944. But first I went on home leave, my last leave of the war. It was June, the month of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Shortly before leaving my company, I participated in a search and destroy operation against Russian commandos, during which we inflicted some casualties and took a few prisoners. Each of the Russians carried a small can made of white metal that obviously contained an emergency ration. Hoping that the cans contained some meat, we lost no time taking them as spoils of war, especially since we suspected them to have come from America. Happy with my little prize, I decided to save it for my starving parents. Finally, my long-awaited day of departure came. The journey was a combination of all sorts of transportation. The first leg was a ride on a one-axle cart pulled by a mule. It took me to the delousing facility through which all soldiers bound for Germany had to pass. Then came a 500-kilometre truck ride on the Arctic Ocean Road to Rovaniemi. There I boarded a boxcar of the Finnish Railway for a 24-hour ride to Turku in South Finland. Next came an even longer journey on the Baltic Sea in the bowels of a ship bound for Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland. The following trip on the military train to Berlin was the least uncomfortable part of the journey. The capital was already heavily damaged by air attacks, but functioning remarkably well. A short ride on the city transit took me from Berlin's Stettiner station to the city's Potsdamer station, where I boarded a military train to the west. Since trains in Western Germany were attacked with increasing frequency by low-flying American fighter aircraft, the passenger soldiers were instructed to fire at the attackers in the event the train was forced to stop. This was one of the reasons why all of them carried their weapons and ammunition. Fortunately, they didn't need them this time. The other reason was the Allied invasion of June 1944. Many soldiers arriving for a hard-earned vacation from the Eastern Front were sent immediately into combat at the Western Front. In the eastern part of the country, it was the other way around. The situation at both fronts was so precarious that the hard-pressed Army Command, in moments of crisis, had no other recourse than sending vacationing soldiers into battle. The Lancers had coined a fitting name for the officers who had the hated job of sending vacationers into combat. They called them Heldenklaus, hero thieves, following the proverbial coal thief, whose black face lurked everywhere from posters with the inscription, "Coal thief is going around." The verb klauen, an etymological relative of to claw, is a German colloquialism for to steal. The hard-pressed Ministry for Armament and War Materials had invented the villain Kohlenklau in an attempt to motivate the population to save coal and energy. It was midnight when I arrived in Dortmund. The sky was still red from the fires of an air raid the night before. The railway station was heavily damaged but functioning, while vast stretches of the city lay in ashes, with no telephones, no streetcars, no communication or transportation of any kind. It was a walk of about an hour from the station to the house of my parents, but it took twice as long because, at a site where rescue operations were underway, I was asked to help. The rescuers were freeing corpses from a shelter in which they had been scalded by boiling water. The seething fluid had come from an industrial plant in the vicinity and flooded the shelter. We had to wade through a jelly of human flesh. As one rescuer pulled on a leg sticking out from the horrible morass, he had the bare bone in his hand. An hour later, I passed the ruins of the synagogue the Nazis had burned during Kristallnacht of 1938. Now trees were growing on the rubble, while grass was already sprouting from the more recent ruins of some German houses. I thought of Theo, who had the courage and the decency to condemn the barbarity of persecuting innocent people. It was dawn when I arrived at the ruin of my parents' house. There was a sign with the address of their emergency quarters on the outskirts of the city. While streetcars to the outlying districts were still functioning, it was too early for the first vehicle to arrive. Thus, I sat down on the wreckage of the house I had left 4.5 years before. Across the street was the car stop where my father had waved goodbye. The very bricks I was sitting on were the remains of my childhood bedroom that had been located high under the roof. Maybe I could find some of my belongings here. No luck. The looters had already taken care of that. Germans, after all, were not as companionable and brotherly as ultra-nationalist propaganda wanted us to believe. The war went on. A rescue crew was marching by, sirens were sounding, American fighter aircraft were overhead. A book from the First World War came to my mind, All Quiet on the 1% Stern Front by Erich Maria Remarque. It had always been the paradigm of treason to me. Now it was the truth. I was mentally so exhausted that I felt tempted to open the little can of meat I had taken from a dead Russian. Almost without thinking, I pulled it from my backpack and weighed it in my hands. Only then did I remember that it was to be a present for my parents. Overcome with sudden emotion, I put it back and wept. When my parents saw me, they also cried, while I was shocked at how emaciated they looked. The continuous air raids and the constant hunger had taken their toll. I was glad to have the small can with me. It turned out to contain corned beef, a cherished delicacy. My father pronounced the name cornet beef and said it could only have come from America. My mother didn't touch it, pretending a spell of nausea. Food rations were already below the minimum requirement for maintaining body weight. The Führer package for front soldiers was a thing of the past because Ukraine, where the food had come from, had been lost. Every second day I had to report to a registration centre for front soldiers, which was operated by invalid officers who were no longer fit for combat and often had only one leg or arm. Sometimes entirely new military units were established at the registration places and rushed to the fronts in east, south or west. I had to do my first 2 reportings in person because telephones were still down. After that, I could do it by phone. Miraculously, the Heldenklaus never snatched me, maybe because they couldn't make up their minds at which front the crisis was the worst. My father was depressed by the Allied invasion, and so was I. It worried us that there did not seem to be a decisive counter-offensive. Of course, we didn't know that Hitler had predicted the landing of the Allied forces at the Pas de Calais rather than the coast of Normandy. and that this was the reason why he forbade Field Marshal Rommel to deploy his tanks at the actual landing site, where they were urgently needed. "How long do we want to wait before we drive them out?" my father asked. I was reminded of Goebbels' rhetorical question of almost the same wording a year earlier. On one occasion, my father's mood was lifted, though not mine. It happened when we listened to a radio report about the attacks on England by the Revenge weapons, V-1 and V-2 rockets. In an effort to boost morale, the report exaggerated the effect of the raids on the British population. I still remember the overly dramatic words of the radio reporter, "The island trembles and England is ablaze." My father was so impressed that he thought the war had reached a turning point, but I questioned both the wisdom and the effectiveness of the raids. If we wanted to win Britain over as an ally, this was not the way to go. Moreover, the logical targets for the rockets would have been the Allied forces in Normandy, not British civilians. This was the first time I had serious doubts about the Führer's leadership qualities. I felt reminded of the relatively mild uneasiness I experienced in 1942 after Hitler attacked Sevastopol in Russia and Tobruk in North Africa within the same week. However, in those early days I was not ready to admit that two simultaneous offensives against different enemies on separate continents were a strategic blunder. Now it was different. With the Allied invasion in full swing, I could no longer escape the conclusion that using the powerful rockets for cheap revenge rather than purposeful combat was a grievous mistake. Though I had made some progress in liberating myself from the mental prison of my childhood, I had still a long way to go. My weakness was that I saw only Hitler's strategic blunders, not his crimes. Part of this imbalance was undoubtedly the result of the fact that his military misfortunes were all too obvious, while his crimes were relatively well hidden, at least to my eyes. But part of it was also psychological. Hitler had been my hero since childhood. He was still the rock on which my world was founded. In this regard, not much had changed since the days I had marched with the Hitler Youth. My life was still dominated by the evil sorcerer, and I was not yet ready to take him down from his pedestal. When my mother heard the exaggerated report of the destruction the rockets had caused in England, she was sad. "My God," she murmured, "the poor people." Constant worrying about her 3 sons, the neural injury from the air raids, and the pain of starvation had heightened, rather than dulled, her sensitivity to the suffering of others. The only occasion on which she used harsh words was when she referred to the Allied bombers. She called them beasts, but that was more an outcry of pain than an expression of hatred. She hated nobody, only the war. My parents told me that they had evacuated our former house only a few weeks before it was destroyed. All of their belongings, except the few clothes they carried with them, were lost. After the First World War, my father's Swiss life insurance had been confiscated by the Allies as part of the war reparations. "I had paid for it in gold mark," he lamented, "and now it's the same thing all over again. Everything we have accumulated in the last 20 years is reduced to rubble." He did not mention the Jews, which I noticed with relief. Apparently he had forgotten the senseless hatred I had come to hate. We enjoyed the few days of my vacation as much as possible. Had it not been for the constant threat that the Heldenklaus might snatch me, we would have enjoyed the beautiful summer days even more. Once, while we were walking through the village, American fighter aircraft strafed it with machine gun fire. "Too bad we left your rifle at home," my father said wistfully. On the day of my departure, I insisted that my parents stay at home. The military trains were now greatly improved. They were shorter and more frequent. While some of the cars were damaged, there was plenty of room. I was amazed at how well everything was functioning. Trains were rolling east and west, laden with soldiers and material. It was a marvel of organization, but it was also the last time I felt anything akin to national pride. The Americans, who had unwittingly provided me with the welcome gift of corned beef, also gave me a farewell present. Shortly after the train had pulled out of the station, it was attacked by fighter aircraft. Having hardly gained any speed, the train came to a quick stop. We rushed out to return fire, but the aircraft had already disappeared. Just as I got up from the ground, I discovered a bullet the aircraft had left behind. Though I didn't treasure the bullet as much as the can of corned beef, I picked it up as a souvenir for my comrades at the Arctic Ocean front. As I was re-entering my railcar, I overheard the conversation of two officers. They used an expression I had never heard before, but would hear with increasing frequency in the months ahead, particularly after the war. It was GROFAS, a sardonic acronym for Größter Feldherr aller Zeiten, greatest military genius of all times. At the time, I did not understand its meaning, much less its ridicule, but I had the uneasy feeling that it was an unflattering nickname for Hitler. After the war, I learned that it was used mainly by disillusioned officers and other people who, as far as information was concerned, were more privileged than I was. In Danzig, I entered a Front Sammelstelle, Front Soldiers Assembly Facility. The Nazis had Stellen, offices, places, facilities, for everything. There were Stellen for delousing, receiving ration cards, registering losses from air raids, declaring possession of foreign currencies, reporting for duties such as clearing away rubble, rescuing the living and the dead, extinguishing fires, collecting paper and metal, receiving training and indoctrination, and so on. There were even Stellen for Jews to assemble for transportation to the concentration camps. Waiting for a ship to take me to Finland, I spent about a week at the front assembly facility in Danzig. The place was so dirty that I used every opportunity to escape. One beautiful summer evening I went to town to admire the Gothic brickwork of the old patrician houses and churches. This was the town in which the first shot of the war had been fired. It was still unscathed, but 6 months later most of it would be rubble. As I was standing in front of a picturesque church, I overheard two elderly men in civilian clothes. "Grofaz," said one of them. "Yes," replied the other. "He thinks he is another Alexander." Now I got the message. Ironically, it made me angry. "Watch your tongue," I yelled at the two elders, whereupon they quickly disappeared. When I arrived in Rovaniemi, the capital of Lapland, I entered another front assembly facility, waiting for a truck to take me to the north. During the day, the waiting soldiers had to work, but in the evening they were granted a few hours to enjoy the last days of the Nordic summer. That's when the second part of Roper's tragedy occurred. It was a pleasant summer evening. We were about 100 soldiers, loitering in front of the camp gate. Most were smoking the atrocious stuff that passed for tobacco, but I did not, because I always exchanged my cigarettes for something edible. I was talking to some new acquaintances when I heard a voice behind me saying, "Unteroffizier Mans." Unteroffizier meant corporal. Turning around, I saw Roper. Though it was unusual for him to address me by rank and last name, I unsuspectingly extended my hand to greet him. With a sad smile, he raised his arms to show me that he was handcuffed. Then I saw the two military policemen behind him. Before I could ask any questions, they ordered me to avoid any contact with the prisoner and then pulled him away. It was the last I saw of Roper, but not the last I heard of him. When I arrived at my company, I learned that Roper had tried to desert to Sweden. He was already on Swedish soil when the military police caught him with the help of their bloodhounds. That evening, when I had seen him in Rovaniemi, he had just arrived as a prisoner in the custody of the military police. His fate was sealed. A military tribunal quickly sentenced him to death by firing squad. However, for reasons unknown to me, he was not executed in Finland, but loaded on a ship headed for Germany. Today I don't remember the name of the ship, but a few months later I heard it again aboard a ship from Hammerfest to Narvik. In the meantime, there were two developments of overriding importance. One was the attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944. I was shocked and outraged. The official bulletin spoke of a small clique of ambitious officers. That was for me the key word. I had never trusted officers, and now I felt contempt for them. They were still remnants from imperial times, Herren, feudal lords, not Lancers, even less National Socialists. I was so angry that I behaved disrespectfully to the company commander. Fortunately, he didn't mind, for he was as outraged as I was. In the next few days, to my own amazement, I calmed down considerably and felt as if I had been drugged. Ironically, the sedative effect came from the mysterious expression "grof as" that had baffled me ever since I had heard it on my journey back from home leave. The officers who used this pejorative term for Hitler must have had a reason. Perhaps they felt that things could no longer go on the way they did. Maybe the conspirators had come to the conclusion that peace with the West was imperative. Obviously, that would have brought them into conflict with Grofas, who was fanatically determined to continue the two-front war at all costs. Thoughts of this nature appeased my anger at the plotting officers. After all, I had pondered equally heretical ideas, and even aired them to my comrades. Moreover, these high-ranking officers had information I was not privy to. If I knew all the things they know, I persuaded myself, I dared not finish the thought. It was too seductive and potentially destructive. Where would it end? I could not afford such daydreams. I had to do my duty. Over there was the enemy. Sad and sobered, I picked up my submachine gun and went to inspect one of our strongholds. No, I did not give a pep talk there. I had grown out of that. The other development was the capitulation of Finland in September 1944. Field Marshal Mannerheim, whom I held in high esteem, had secretly negotiated the terms of surrender. Now the Nazis took him down from his pedestal and branded him a half-Jewish subhuman. The concern was understandable, though not the ire. The 20th Mountain Army operating at the Arctic Ocean front was now cut off from the homeland. Quick and forceful action was needed to prevent another Stalingrad. I took Mannerheim's decision as another bad omen. He was a competent general and statesman, and he certainly was no friend of the Soviets. If he was ready to put his nation at the mercy of their archenemy, then he must have come to the conclusion that Germany could no longer win the war. Adding to my suspicion was Hitler's continued silence and absence from sight. Only Goebbels and Speer allowed themselves to be seen in the bombed cities. Where was Grofas? I was still brooding over these problems when word arrived that the 19th Mountain Army Corps would retreat to Norway. The plans and directives for the retreat were so sensitive that they could not be discussed over the field telephones. Mentioning them on the wire by only a single word was a major offence to be dealt with by military tribunal. It was a busy time for the messengers who went back and forth with messages in their heads, never on paper. In planning the retreat of our company, the commander assigned me the task of leading the support group. My column consisted of 2 field kitchens, food, ammunition, medical equipment, and horses. On the day of withdrawal, the group was to leave as soon as it was completely dark, and the company was to follow a few hours later. Hiding the retreat from the Russians as long as possible was of the utmost importance. I had 6 men and 7 horses. We marched in total darkness along a trail I knew fairly well. The first hour or so passed without incident. Suddenly, however, the Russian artillery opened up. They fired from all barrels and almost without pause. It was the heaviest artillery barrage I have ever encountered. At times, the whole landscape was illuminated from the flashes of the exploding shells. Somehow, the Russians had discovered our retreat. We had to take cover while holding on to the horses, but the animals panicked and dragged us over the rocky terrain. Shell fragments ricocheted from boulders and banged against the field kitchens. Suddenly, my horse collapsed over me. As I tried to free myself, I felt warm horse blood running down my face and over my uniform. The stains would remain there for more than a month, and the horse blood would mix with human blood. Another horse was wounded. Both had to be killed, and their load redistributed. Thus, we spent more time taking cover and reloading equipment than marching. It was long past the time when the company was supposed to follow. Eventually, they caught up with us, and so did the Russians. There was some hand-to-hand fighting amidst renewed artillery barrages. Apparently, the Russian artillerymen didn't mind killing a few of their own people. Confusion reigned. The lingering darkness made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Shells exploded. Ducking figures darted from cover to cover. Scraps of words from 2 languages intermingled. Wounded men moaned. Horses panicked, while the wavering dawn cast an eerie light over the ghastly scene. As I was crawling toward a big boulder, I suddenly recognized the company commander. He said the company could hold its position long enough for me to move on with the support group. He wanted me to deliver it to the battalion as fast as possible, which I did with 1 dead man hanging over a horse like an outlaw in a Western movie. Our battalion served as rear guard for the division. The Russians were trying to encircle our troops, and we had the mission of holding them up as long as possible. There was only one way from east to west, a German-built supply road that met the Arctic Ocean Road at Petsamo. Everything on wheels moved along that artery. The Russians had landed tanks at Lunahamari, Petsamo's harbour, trying to interdict the traffic on the supply road. To make it impassable for them, our sappers mined the road as soon as the bulk of our troops had passed through. They didn't wait for us, however. We were marching and fighting almost day and night. After a few days, we had used up the food and drink we carried with us. New food was not coming, and the emergency ration could only be touched on express orders. Worst, however, was the lack of sleep. I was almost delirious from sleep deprivation. Then there were the casualties. Time permitting, the dead were buried on the spot, and the wounded who were unable to walk were loaded on one-axle carts and pulled by one of us on the dirt road, in spite of the mines. Since these were anti-tank mines, it was hoped that they would not detonate if a man stepped on them. After about a week, our company was taken out of the front line and held as battalion reserve. We were directed to some abandoned barracks down the road, where we also found some food. We had just started cooking, washing and sleeping when a messenger arrived. The poor man was in total shock and unable to speak. With foam in his mouth, he emitted only animal-like sounds and gesticulated wildly toward the front line. The company commander interpreted this as an alert and gave the order to break camp. A few minutes later, we were again on the march, this time in an eastern direction toward the Russians. After a forced march of about 20 minutes, we reached the battalion command centre where the captain was waiting for us behind a huge boulder. I still remember his exact words. "Men, who wants to earn himself the Iron Cross First Class?" I immediately raised my hand, whereupon I was appointed leader of an assault troop of about 10 men. The Russians had just overrun one of the battalion's companies, and our company had to perform a manoeuvre called Gegenstoss, counter-thrust, as distinct from a well-prepared counter-attack. My group was to spearhead the assault. My men exchanged their rifles for submachine guns, and each tucked 2 hand grenades under his belt. Then we took off. As I stormed ahead of my group, I lost the fear that normally was my steady companion. I think the others felt the same. We were in a rage. Otherwise, we could not have maintained the accelerated pace. After 2 or 3 minutes of ducked running, we reached the makeshift defense position where the Russians had broken through. Since we did not immediately realize that hand-to-hand fighting was still going on, we first threw our hand grenades and then jumped in. I stumbled on 2 men lying on the ground who were wrestling face to face. The upper man, a Russian with a knife in one hand, tried to stab the lower man, a German, who had grasped the attacker's wrist with both hands, trying to deflect the knife. The Russian in his padded suit and spiked headgear looked huge to me. Today I am not sure whether his enormous size was real or merely the result of my agitation. At any rate, I stepped next to the frightful giant, put the muzzle of my submachine gun tightly to his head, and pulled the trigger. So enraged was I that I didn't let go until I had emptied the entire magazine, 16 bullets in all, into his head. It was a grave mistake, as I should learn minutes later. The German cried for help in freeing himself from the colossus who had collapsed over him. He was covered all over with blood. As I pulled him out from under the dead enemy, I also covered myself with blood. Now I recognized the comrade. He was a corporal from one of our sister companies, a barber in civil Ian life, who had cut my hair a few times. Neither of us spoke a word because there was no time, but 6 months later we met again in Narvik. Now the company commander arrived with the rest of the company. Seconds later, the Russians waged a counterattack. As we had done before, they first threw their hand grenades and then leaped forward. One Russian who emerged from a makeshift foxhole jumped at me. I pointed my submachine gun at him and pulled the trigger, but the magazine was empty. Luckily, the man stopped and maintained his position for a split second, just enough time for me to turn my weapon around and slam it into his head. The blow put him out of action, but it also broke my weapon into 2 parts. To my horror, I noticed that I held only the barrel in my hands. Now I was without a weapon, except for the bayonet I had always considered a useless appendage. Nevertheless, I drew it. At that moment, somebody cried that the company commander was wounded. I put my bayonet back in its sheath and crawled over to the lieutenant. He had a gushing wound over one brow, probably from a hand grenade fragment, but was still conscious. As I tried to bandage him, he ordered me to stop and organize one more counter-thrust. The Russians were about 30 meters away. Some of us had one hand grenade left. On my command, we sprayed the enemy with submachine gun fire, threw the remaining hand grenades and jumped forward. To my surprise, we did not receive much fire in return. The Russians seemed to retreat, awaiting reinforcements. At any rate, we were in control of the situation, at least for the time being. Thus, I ordered my men to take defensive positions. Then I crawled back to the wounded company commander. Now the lieutenant was barely conscious. That should have been reason enough for me to take command of the company on the spot. Instead, I tended to his wounds. Today, I can't tell whether I was looking for an escape from combat or acting out of real concern for the only officer to whom I felt a strong personal allegiance. The human heart sometimes likes to hide its feelings, even from its owner. Today, the whole scene appears unreal to me, as if I was in a trance. At any rate, the following 30 minutes or so were the low point of my military career. Today, I am neither proud nor ashamed of them. After applying a bandage, a messenger and I laid the lieutenant on a tarpaulin and dragged him down to the road, which was about 100 meters away. He cried out with pain and then lost consciousness. At the road, we loaded him onto a cart and then raced off in a westward direction, hoping to meet a medic or somebody to whom we could consign the wounded officer. But the road was mined. That alone wouldn't have bothered us so much, had it not been for the continuing rain of artillery shells that detonated the mines. Eventually, we reached the sappers who were laying the mines, and knew that the road ahead of us was not yet mined. A little later, we met a column of reinforcements, headed by an officer in a jeep-like motorcar. It was a risky situation, as I was without a weapon and running away from the enemy. But the officer simply threw me a loaded rifle and pointed east, whereupon we surrendered the wounded lieutenant to him and turned around. A little later I was back at my company and took command. It was just in time because a messenger from the battalion commander arrived with special instructions addressed to me as company commander. We had to take defensive positions until nightfall, then withdraw under cover of darkness. Our retreat went undiscovered for about 20 minutes before Russian infantry attacked. There was renewed fighting, and there were again casualties. The dead were left on the spot, and the wounded were carried down to the road where a few carts still could be found, yet not as many as were needed. Walter was one of the wounded lucky enough to be evacuated. I never saw him again. The company was now reduced to about 60 men. When we were not in immediate contact with the enemy, I marched ahead of a long, stretched column. As we were snaking around a little hill to our right, we unexpectedly received fire from ahead. I thought we were encircled and gave the Ludwig command, whereupon the column performed a large sweep to the left. It was the right thing to do, though not exactly for the right reason. Nevertheless, it took the Russians by surprise. Instead of pursuing us, they only fired after us, which we acknowledged with some fire in return. Eventually, we broke contact. It was then that I gave the fateful command to throw our gas masks away, an action that later brought me an indictment for sabotage before a military tribunal. When I gave the rash order, I had persuaded myself that discarding the relatively bulky piece of equipment would accelerate our retreat and possibly save us from Russian captivity. I also thought that nobody would wage chemical warfare at the shore of the Arctic Ocean. However, as I would learn a few months later, the military bureaucracy thought otherwise. The following days were an alternate succession of marching and fighting. Little food, not much drink, and hardly any sleep. Eventually we reached the Petsamo River that emptied into the Arctic Ocean at Linnanmäki. The Arctic Ocean Road ran parallel to the river on its west bank. A steel bridge over the river connected the supply road with the Arctic Ocean Road. On our side of the river, the east side, stretched a narrow meadow that would be the scene of an unsung tragedy the following day. Apparently the meadow once had been the main support of a farm that was now abandoned. The battalion was forming a bridgehead around the east end of the bridge. Since it was already dark when I arrived with the rest of my company, we were ordered to take positions before dawn the next day. That gave us a few hours of rest. Yearning for a place to sleep, My messengers and I entered a barn that was crowded with mountaineers. It was pitch dark. As we tumbled over sleeping bodies, we generated a chorus of Bavarian swearing. Eventually, I found a tiny spot to lie down. Before I sank into a hypnotic sleep, I had two sensations I still remember. One was the spicy smell of the moss I used as a pillow. The other was the beginning of a little speech offered by an officer who apparently found the situation quite interesting. "Now I shall tell you where the Russians will attack tomorrow." I couldn't care less. It was still dark when we assumed defensive positions on an elevated plateau from which we could control the bridge. At daybreak we could see our troops crossing the bridge and the Russian tanks rolling in from the north. Then the Russian infantry attacked. According to orders, we fought back and withdrew at a pace that had been planned in advance. We had to surrender so much terrain in such and such time. All company commanders and most platoon leaders had official wristwatches for such occasions. Now the much-coveted pieces of equipment helped us to draw the semicircle around the bridge ever tighter at a preset pace. In the last hours before crossing the bridge, I had one of those experiences that mould one's character. It concerned a corporal of one of our sister companies, whom I had always considered a wretched yes-man. At one of the pep talks I had given almost a year ago, he told me that my ideas about America and Britain were heretic, and that he preferred, as he put it, to follow the Führer blindly wherever he would lead him. I had ridiculed the man for the qualifier blindly, though not for following the Führer. "What do you have eyes for if you don't want to use them?" I had argued. We all follow the Führer, but with our eyes open. With that inconsistent polemic, I had hoped to silence the poor fellow, but he had the temerity to rebut, "If the Führer leads me, I don't need eyes." Since that time I had always referred to him as the blind man. Now the blind man was holding a defensive position which, according to orders, should not be surrendered for another 30 minutes or so. I was afraid of being captured by the Russians and wanted to retreat faster. But he refused and coolly stayed behind a boulder, firing shot after shot at the advancing enemy. Without knowing it, this blind follower of Grofaz was teaching me a lesson worthwhile to remember. A man who unknowingly serves evil does not lose his dignity as long as he is absolutely true to himself. Under a hail of gunfire, I silently begged this paragon of loyalty for forgiveness and stayed with him until it was time for a legitimate retreat. About 2 hours later, the two of us approached the bridge. There was only a handful of men left who still had to cross it. The sappers, who were ready to blow it up, were waiting on the other side, yelling for us to hurry. The trouble was that we first had to cross the narrow meadow along the river. Now it was under fire from a Russian heavy machine gun. We were all lying behind a shallow earth wall, from where we could hear the persistent sist of the bullets. As my new friend, the blind man, leaped forward to run across the meadow, he was hit. With his hands pressed against his chest, he returned in panic. As his heart's blood was gushing out, he collapsed over me. "Put a bandage on," were his last words. I still hear him saying that in his southern dialect. It was too late. Before I could even reach for my set of bandages, he convulsed and died. All I could do was to rip open the blood-drenched tunic over his chest to retrieve his identity badge. As we were trained to do, I broke off the lower half and later turned it in to identify him as killed in action. There was no time to bury him. The sappers shouted that the bridge would blow up very soon. I don't know how I crossed the meadow. I only recall that I wanted to look back at the good comrade I had left at the other side, as one of the engineers wrestled me to the ground. "Don't do anything stupid, my boy," he said in a fatherly tone of voice as he pinned me down. He was an elderly man with a kind face. When he saw that I was covered with blood, both fresh and stale, he patted me on the shoulder. "You shouldn't be here. Neither should I." Seconds later, the bridge blew up and collapsed into 3 pieces. We were just raising our heads from the ground when the Russians on the east bank sounded a frenetic hurrah, as if to applaud us for a job well done. We knew we had to retreat quickly before they were able to train their heavy machine guns on us. There was only one road to the west, a dirt road from Petsamo to Kirkenes. It was the same road on which my company had been broken up by a snowstorm in February 1943. Now the company was broken up again, this time by the Russians. Night was falling. I marched with someone whose identity I never found out. Sometimes we rested by the roadside with a tarpaulin over both of our heads to protect us against the cold. I believe if I met the unknown comrade again, I would recognize him by his bad smell. Once, when we were resting, a messenger arrived on a motorcycle, tore the tarpaulin from our heads, and told us that we were supposed to march as fast as possible. After several days, I had reassembled my company, only some 40 men in all. Now the greatest hardship was the long marches day after day. There was some danger that the Russians would land ahead of us and cut us off, but it never happened. Apparently they didn't have the naval power. One day we found an abandoned German food supply camp. Unfortunately, it stored only butter and sugar. The storage barrack had been flattened by heavy vehicles, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of butter, sugar, and mud. Worse still, there were a few decomposed corpses of Russian soldiers lying around. Apparently, they had been prisoners of war who worked at the supply camp. I don't know who had killed them, and I had neither the time nor the stomach to investigate. There was also a cistern with water that was covered with a green mould. Minding neither corpses nor mould, each of us broke off a piece of the sugared butter and gulped it down. Carefully pushing the green mould aside, we filled our pots with water from the cistern and drank it. Under normal circumstances, such eating habits would have been harmful, to say the least. But I don't recall any incidents of sickness among my men. One of the worst things that could happen to a man during was diarrhea, particularly at night when we were sleeping in tents. It seems that nature provides its strongest protection when immunity is most urgently needed. However, one problem bothered me greatly, a bleeding blister on the small toe of my right foot. The infected wound had turned marching into torture for me. I often looked longingly after the jeep-like motorcar in which the battalion commander rode back and forth to supervise his troops on the march. Now I was so desperate that I wanted to cut a hole in the shoe to relieve the pressure. But that would have been sabotage of a piece of defence property. To circumvent the problem, I was looking for an ownerless shoe that I could sabotage to my heart's content. Luckily, I stumbled on the grave of a German soldier that was marked by a pair of shoes dangling from a makeshift cross. Never in my life had I thought of becoming a grave robber, but on this relentless march I had dreamt incessantly of a shoe with a hole in it. Now the dream came true. My own shoe was in my backpack, and the sabotaged shoe with the hole was on my foot. One cold morning, when we were just crawling out of our tents by the roadside, the battalion commander arrived in his motor car. The driver, a sergeant, jumped out and instructed me to present the company to the commander. When my men were lined up, the sergeant announced that the commander had just been promoted to major and should be addressed accordingly. Then the major stepped out, wearing a coat over his tunic. As he sounded his accustomed Guten Morgen manner, he was smiling for a change. Our unaccustomed Guten Morgen, Herr Major, was not quite as cheerful, causing me to expect his habitual rebuke. But the freshly baked major was in an unusually good mood. "Men, the Führer has just awarded a soldier of the battalion the Knight Cross." That was more than I expected. Of course, I had not forgotten that the commander had promised me the Iron Cross First Class, the higher one of the two Iron Crosses, on the battlefield. But the Knight Cross? Truly, my deeds were not that great. Well, as it turned out, the commander seemed to share my opinion. With a theatrical gesture, like a magician on the stage, he opened his coat to reveal the Knight Cross dangling from his neck. I still expected to receive the Iron Cross I, but it never came. Several weeks later, I was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class, the lower of the two. I was deeply disappointed. I didn't dispute that the commander deserved the Knight Cross. I simply thought that I deserved the Iron Cross First Class True. I had panicked in the middle of the battle for about 30 minutes, but virtually nobody had noticed, certainly not the battalion commander. Today I feel differently. The commander's Knight Cross is none of my business. Moreover, whether or not I deserved the Iron Cross First Class no longer interests me. All that counts is whether or not I am the kind of person who wants to be decorated with insignias from Germany's most shameful period of history. The answer to this question, I believe, is these memoirs. Before the war, I had been denied several insignias from the Hitler Youth, among them the shoulder strap, the Munich identification card, and the golden Hitler Youth emblem. And now, at the war's end, I added the Iron Cross First Class to the list. At the times when these decorations were denied to me, I coveted them. Today, I consider it conspicuously meaningful that I never received any of them. It was snowing when we arrived at Hammerfest, the northernmost town of Norway. There were only 2 hours of light left in the day. A ship was waiting to take us to an undisclosed destination. Before we left, our men forced a Norwegian farmer to dig out the carcass of a pig he was trying to hide from us. In spite of the hunger that pained me, I was unable to eat any of the smelly roast. The next day, as we sailed out of the mountain-lined fjord, the sun climbed over the horizon and immersed the snow-covered mountains in glimmers of red and gold. A few days later, we passed through the Tromsø fjord north of Narvik. In dim daylight, we witnessed one of the less heralded naval tragedies of the war. A German battleship, the Tirpitz, sister ship of the Bismarck, had keeled over in November 1944. The British bombers had learned to place their bombs not on the ship, but next to it, causing the water pressure to turn it over. Several rescue boats were swarming around the helpless giant, trying to cut holes through the armoured hull for the 1,800 sailors trapped inside to escape. But only 85 were rescued. 48 years later, when I visited the watery grave of the battleship Arizona at Pearl Harbor, I remembered the Tirpitz. For a moment I felt a certain bitterness about the supposed injustice of life, but soon regained the treasured equanimity that I owe partly to old age and partly to America, my chosen country. With a sense of wholeness I had never felt as a German, I experienced a truth which to me not only is a lesson of history, but a revelation of the meaningfulness of human affairs, both personal and national. Standing above the tomb of the Arizona, I thought that all brave and decent soldiers deserved to be honoured, no matter on which side they fought. But the sailors of the Arizona died in the defence of freedom, while the sailors of the Tirpitz, knowingly or not, died in the service of evil. Thus, the iron tomb of the Arizona turned into a monument to freedom, while the watery grave of the Tirpitz became a tragic reminder that valour alone is not a sufficient guard against the onslaught of evil. Therein lies the meaning that history eventually confers to all the tragedies of war, no matter how meaningless they may appear at the moment.